Well, good day. It is Monday morning, January 24th. It's about 10:30 a.m. Central Time, and welcome back. We're going to jump into part three, which is actually the last third of the very expanded version of the presentation I delivered again on December 2nd in December at the Omaha Corral of the Westerners. And this is actually my favorite part. And actually, this is actually the reason why I was motivated to create this presentation. About a year and a half ago, after reading and reading and reading, reflecting on all of my visits, reflecting on just a variety of things I had seen on Little Bighorn Associates Facebook group, on their pro boards, on other discussion groups, Custer Battlefield Memorial History Association, our Monument History Association, to the Little Bighorn discussion group, to friends of the battlefield, to things I've seen on YouTube. From some of the great speakers at that are staff at the battlefield that you can get on the National Park Service's battlefield YouTube channel, and on and on. As I move through these materials, I don't know, some lights came on, and this part is that light, because I was like, wow, I can't see this unless I see the whole, unless I see all four views, as John Carroll called the federal view, but I can't see all the views. So that is the key to this. And so with that, we're going to cover those four views. But with that, before I finish this up, we'll jump ahead to where we've been. Of course, I talked about my reaction the first time I saw the battlefield in '91. And now that I've reflected on it, it reminds me it has to be similar to what America felt in July of 1876. And I'm talking about those of European ancestry that had come here, created our United States of America with its Constitution and states and all of that, and what that culture was and is with us today. So I had the same reaction, which is, how could this happen? Who's to blame? No, this couldn't have happened to Lieutenant Colonel Custer in the 7th. There's no way. It doesn't make sense. So, I've taken it through my reaction. I've taken it through some background. We've covered the battle itself. And now we're ready to jump in to myths and lies. There are a couple things, though, before I move on, some footnotes here. I want to jump onto the battlefield, onto the battle itself, the battle, yes. So when we think of the battle, I want you to just, I can't stress this enough. In my about 50-minute talk, there's a lot more there. And so within the constraints of time, with the gifts of the photographs and the maps, Richard Newman's, and so on, and of course the resources I was relying on, what I wanted you to do is see where people were at, so you could understand those relationships, and then you could see the swiftness and the changing and the reacting and all of those things. I wanted you to see that. But I didn't get into the fact that on Calhoun Hill, that Calhoun is the brother-in-law of General Custer, and that he had 80 men on Calhoun Hill, and they put up a fight. Ultimately, they were over the hill with Keogh. But I did allude to Chief Gull, and later in the battle, them coming up and finally overrunning Keogh. But there's a lot more here. I didn't cover, Major Reno's retreat. I said it retreated, but I didn't say he lost 40% of his men, which he did. He lost more than 30 directly, and then there were about 18 missing when they got to the top of that hill. And that when Frederick Benteen, Captain Benteen, had arrived with his 3 companies, and then later to about 3 o'clock, as we know, and then later to be joined by McDougal and the pack train, I didn't go into what happened there, such as that, Benteen had those orders, come quick, bring packs, come quick, big village, written by Cook, the adjutant for Lieutenant Colonel Custer's 5 companies and the whole command. But I didn't go into that because Major Reno said, for God's sakes, man, don't go forward. Can't you see I've lost half my regiment? So when Captain Benteen arrived, I mean, this was unimaginable. And every message they had from the messengers coming, bringing those 2 messages from Custer's position, their verbal reports were that the general had them on the run, that they were skedaddling. So what Benteen came upon was unimaginable. Wounded, men crawling up the hills, men dead on the hillside, them being attacked. Also, I didn't mention as well that when they got to that hill, although the vast majority of the warriors made a shift, many did continue to fire away at that hill, and I would argue to keep them pinned down. Now, as all of you go through your own studies, and I encourage you to do that, and please remember, as I said at the beginning, I'm taking positions because it's an honest thing for me to do. I've studied this thing on and off since 91. I'm not gonna brag my bona fides, but 90, 100 books, I don't know. I mean, all the things I've done, this is where I'm at. And also, if we think about Professor Gallagher, that doesn't mean that I might find something and it'll change the position. Michael Donahue reports, he is working on research that will show, and he's sure of it, that General Custer, when he went to Fort D, he was trying to get hostages or prisoners so he could negotiate. We'll see. Based on where I'm at today, oh, man, Michael, I'm really looking forward to it. But anyway, I just want to give that footnote to the battle. With that, that's a great transition to where we're moving now, which is down to the myths. And oh my goodness, this historical event is surrounded with a lot of myths. The myths can be in the art. By the way, Michael Donahue on the National Park Service's Little Bighorn Battlefield YouTube channel has a wonderful multi-video. They're about 10 minutes long, 7-8 minutes. Michael has an art background. He teaches art in a college down in Texas. He's an artist unto himself, in addition to being a seasonal interpreter and guide and historian at the battlefield itself. But he has a wonderful series there. But the art, as Michael will tell you, it's all about the myths. And I don't know if it was intentional. Michael Donahue can tell you that better than I can, as many others can. But from like 2 weeks after the battle, we started having pictures that would portray various scenes based on what people perceived based on who they are. But myths, in terms of the writing, in terms of everything, this battle has got a lot in it. But thankfully, in the last 20, 30 years, 40 years, maybe, a lot of things have come together. But you can't, on the other hand, we have to go back to all the original testimonies that were gathered by all of the people like Marquis and Camp and Graham compiled them. I mean, they just go on and on and on. The folks that interviewed, there's a fellow named Nabokov who interviewed two-leggings. There's Linderman Frank Linderman, who went and sat with Plenty Coups, who's a Crow. I mean the wealth of them. There's a person named Josephine Wagoner. Her manuscripts were published in 2014 by the University of Nebraska Press. And we need about where she went out, she's a Hunkpapa. And in the 1920s, she wanted to make sure her ancestor stories were not lost. There's about I understand, an 800-page book it's right up there it sounds like it's right up there with the best of the best that we have that was published in 13 and 14. It describes the feelings of the Hunkpapa and of course how some of them fled to the north, some of them fled to the mountains, some of them resigned themselves ultimately. Even after that, they either starved, some of them were able to make a way for themselves, some of them came back to the reservations. But we have to have all that historical information. But In light of that, let's jump in to the lies and the myths. Now you can see on this slide, I'm gonna make my slide show bigger. You can see that I've scratched off a number of these. Now, when I published this deck to on the Little Bighorn Associates Facebook site, and I'll put it on, I have a Facebook site that I've created called How to Study and Learn About the Battle of Little Bighorn. I'll post it out there. I'll remove the draw-throughs, but we have already covered a number of these. But I've added some that I think will kind of, I've put a couple new ones on here as I've moved through this. And so let's have some fun and also hit some, a couple that I had left unturned. One is General Custer should have been expected to follow General Terry's orders. You'll probably remember that in part 2, I shared where I'm at. I shared, considering all the arguments back and forth between Tom Rosser on one side and an officer named Hughes, who's the brother-in-law of General Terry on the other, all these folks. And even General Terry himself wrote that Custer did not do what he wanted him to do. So on and on, I have said where I'm at. But the first time I started to move that direction, I did think to myself, well, if I'm General Terry and my plan is so important, it might be a little disingenuous of me after the battle to say, well, Lieutenant Colonel Custer, I'm going to add my words, was Lieutenant Colonel Custer. And that's why when we get to the slide about the man, General Custer, I think that's just an essential part of study. To be a student of this battle, you must be a student of George Armstrong Custer. And we'll get into some of that. But did Custer do what a reasonable person would expect him to do? I would say probably that was George Armstrong Custer there. You know, there are people that are better students have much deeper knowledge of the general than I do. I've certainly made what I would call the foundational and maybe foundational plus rounds. But my view is that is George Armstrong Custer. He's out front. He's going to be aggressive. He already announced when Major Reno came back from his scout, he chastised the major for not getting the glory for himself. We know that he was sitting in his tent, right? I believe, according to James Willett, he was writing this anonymous piece. It's a hit job piece against Major Reno, castigating him for not taking out the whole camp or the village and going all the way. But yeah, everybody knew who he was. You know, he'd been court-martialed multiple times at West Point in 67, you know, for kind of doing things his way. This man, you know, Phil Sheridan, Terry, even President Grant decided, yeah, let's put him back in charge of the 7th. They kept licking that lollipop. And, you know, so I'm not so sure that, I think so where I'm at is General Terry disobeyed orders, but I'm also at that General Terry should have known better. With respect to Major Reno's withdrawal from the valley, it released the warriors to concentrate on Custer's battalion so they could destroy them. I put that here just because I'm not going to spend much time on that. I do want to just hit that nail quickly. If you reflect on part 2, you look at the maps. Lieutenant Colonel Custer had not 1, not 2. He had 3 messengers come to his command, telling him from Major Reno that this is different than what we expected. We also know that members of the general's command were observing and watching the fighting down there. In Reno's command, there are first-person accounts that they could see, I believe, from the skirmish lines. It might have been from when they were in the woods, but they could see the Gray Horse Company come down. I believe it's Medicine Tail Coulee. We sometimes call it Ford B, like in Boy. It might have been Ford B, I believe. And they could see the men on horses watching, and it was probably confusing to them. So I would say the general chose to go north, knowing what was happening in that valley. It's very unfair to say that Major Reno it was his fault, and because he withdrew his basically effective fighting force of 90 men versus 1,000, that had him pressuring on all sides and shooting down from the hills. I don't know. I think Major Reno made a smart decision, and I think the general wrote a check when he decided to keep going north. Major Reno was drinking, if not drunk, in the valley, and this was a significant factor in Custer's defeat. Okay. Fred Wagner's book, which I didn't bring it up here because I spoke to it on part 2, but his book on Reno in the Valley and the Reno Scout, Fred goes into this painstakingly detailed. There's 8 legitimate supposed sources of Reno being drunk. And Fred, he has no dog in this game. Fred's just a guy who's trying to get it all out, trying to understand this. Some people, one person told me, he says, there's nobody knows more about June 25th than Frederick Wagner. So Fred, if you're listening to this, please don't let that go to your head. But I'd say, I think at least a number of us are looking at you, and we don't think you have an agenda, and you just are trying to get the facts. But Fred clearly shows that the assertions don't stand up. Of course, we know the officers at the Reno Court of Inquiry in the fall '79. That's not part of my talk today. Testify. I cannot believe that the short amount of time that Major Reno was in that valley. I think it may be less than an hour, 45 minutes. So he splits. Let's just think about it. We're just people here in 2022. He's up there at the top of the hill with Lieutenant Colonel Custer, and they're speaking. Now he's going to take his command in the valley. Custer's going to go north. I don't think he had enough time to get his plastered as people assert. I just don't think so. And I do not believe, and I'm speaking as a guy, I don't drink today, but don't think I've ever had a drinking problem. But I've done many of us have done our fair share of drinking. I don't think I can get drunk that fast, to the extent. I mean, and Major Reno and these men, they were kind of hardy guys. They were proven being able to handle their whiskey. And I do not think that General Custer or the others up there at the top of that hill, back when they were splitting, they would have allowed him to command that battalion if they had seen him drunk. And it just doesn't wash. And it does not wash. Captain Benteen disobeyed Lieutenant Colonel's orders to come quick, bring packs. I think I've already covered that with the intro. Again, he got there. What he encountered was totally unexpected. He was ordered by Major Reno to say, for God's sakes, man, you've got to help me I have lost half my battalion. But also, Benteen had an obligation to lend aid. He's a smart guy. Benteen was nominated 2 times to become a brevet brigadier general in his own right. You can read George Mills's biography of Captain Benteen. He's a hardened commander, and he needed to know what he'd be walking into before he went north, and he did not disobey the orders. In fact, he saved. We would not have the come quick, bring packs piece of paper if not for Benteen and Reno. If the first thing he'd have done is destroy that piece of paper, he did not, and we have it for posterity. The 7th Cavalry was defeated because General Crook didn't send word to General Terry's command, warning them of the Sioux after the Rosebud Valley. General Crook caused the defeat of the 7th. Well, first off, and I'm going to grab it, there are, if you read about the Battle of Rosebud, multiple authors, you'll see that General Crook did send men to the north. And sometimes, whether I'm reading those in Troopers with Custer by Brennan Stoll, or I'm reading them elsewhere, people will criticize and say, well, he was covering his butt. He wasn't sincere. But, I'll tell you whose word I do believe. It's Plain Coops. Plain Coops has no dog in the game. He went on to be the THE chief of the Crow he's an amazing man. I actually highly recommend this book, by the way, which I will reference in a minute. But he himself said years later, he says, I always found it curious that people were criticizing General Crook, because he says, there's no way we could have gotten through. There's no way. He said, there's no way we could have gotten up. We could have gone through, let alone would they have known exactly where to go anyway. Beyond that, if you think of the battle action, this is where I'm at. Lieutenant Colonel Custer knew everything. He did decide to not send a scout and to go up Tulloch Creek. He did decide to make that fateful right turn and go past the crow's nest. He decided after Major Reno sent 1, 2, 3 to him that, and we have no evidence that Lieutenant Colonel Custer sent anybody back. And that was over a long period of time in that afternoon. I'm afraid to say that the commander of the 7th Cavalry was defeated because, as Robert Utley says, it wasn't so much that the 7th lost, but that the Sioux and Cheyenne and Arapaho, I'll add on one, but also Lieutenant Colonel Custer made some decisions. Lastly, I'm going to touch on, if Custer had only accepted the offer of Gatling guns, the 7th would have been victorious. Now, I have been advised, and again, I would counsel you, please seek out the experts on these. I'll try to post maybe some resources on that. I hesitate to start naming people because I need to be careful. I named the right resource. But one thing that has struck me is that those Gatling guns are not like the Gatling guns we see in the movie Outlaw Josie Wales. If anybody's seen this classic Western, it is as good as it gets. I think it's Clint Eastwood's best Western. But anyway, of course, at the beginning of the movie, Josie Wales gets on a wagon and he's turning this thing like it's this. I understand the Gatling guns were fixed. They don't turn. Now, I may be wrong about that, but I've read that. The other side is the terrain does not lend itself to the use of those because of the coulees and everything. And Chief Red Cloud, I would encourage you to read Captain Poole's account as the first agent of the Whetstone Agency in 1868 and 69. But was created after the Fort Laramie Treaty. Captain Poole writes in his book that when he accompanied Red Cloud and was with Red Cloud and others in Washington, D.C., it would be in 69. That's, I think, the first time that Red Cloud had visited Washington, D.C., that Red Cloud had seen the big naval guns. The folks in D.C. wanted to impress upon Chief Red Cloud the culture of the city, the civilization. And he came back, he was not impressed. In fact, I believe he made statements, in fact, according to Poole, he made statements while there that he thought those guns were kind of, that his forces could run around them and knock them out, and that they were fixed and that they couldn't move. And he saw them as kind of a folly. Now, those are, of course, big naval guns, but I have a feeling these Gatling guns are the same way. It wouldn't have made a difference. And Lieutenant Colonel Custer, I believe, was right in not taking them with him because they'd have been a pain to bring along. And frankly, they weren't going to be that effective anyway. With that, those are the myths. Now we get into some real interesting parts, which is the challenge of studying the battle. As I said when I kicked off part 1, the introduction of my talks, I really did. I said there's no good foundational texts that get this right. I mean, there's very few. I've yet to see one, but somebody told me, Terry, I've read 1,000 books, and so I guess I've only read 80 or so, and so there's another 920 to go. I'm not going to read 920 more, but maybe there is one out there. But there aren't any. Of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've actually made a point to bring it here. Robert Utley's good old Custer Battlefield, a guide, which actually, by the way, I was looking at the Battlefield's website this morning, hosted by the National Park Service. They have a link to this thing sitting right there on their website still. You know, we do have this book. It was written, I think, in 1950s. It was published. It's written by Edgar Stewart, and it's called Custer Luck. It's well received. Of course, we also have what I would call the more technical text that I referenced repeatedly in the part 2. But one of the problems we have again and again, if I'm just going to bring this up, I mean, it seems to me that so many of the authors, such as Nightingale and so on, they set out to try to solve this like like it's a murder mystery, like they're Sherlock Holmes. They have that perspective I had in 91, rather than stepping back and saying, well, let's see what happened. And yeah, we can use our head, our thoughts, our experiences, counsel of others. Let's see what happened though, and then let's draw some conclusions. And you know, this battle is, honest to gosh, it's just plagued. You know, Marie Sandoz, she wrote The Battle of Little Bighorn. And Paul Hutton, who is a renowned award-winning writer, I believe he lives in New Mexico, associated with New Mexico University and New Mexico State. You know, Paul gave a wonderful talk on this at I think the Sandoz, there's a Sandoz Society, and he talked about this book. He's complimentary that he says we all should read this, but we have to realize this book came out in 1966. It was published posthumously. So I'll give a little bit of a pass to Marie, or Mari. I think I don't have a pronunciation of her first name quite right, but it's kind of a follow-on from her Crazy Horse, Strange Man of the Oglala's book, where that's a wonderful book. And the notes from that Crazy Horse book of Marie's are used today. I mean, they, she went out and interviewed, and another person interviewed a variety of participants, people that knew Crazy Horse firsthand. But that book is criticized because she may have gotten a little too close to her subject. And of course, she attacks Chief Red Cloud somewhat. That's where we get started on the whole Red Cloud Spotted Tail. We're scheming to kill Crazy Horse. And there's probably a little bit of truth to that, but there's a lot more to the story about why they were choosing not to support Crazy Horse. But she also, she really makes a run with a lot of falsehoods here that are kind of, the suicide stuff from Marquis with his supposed interview of Wooden Leg and so on. So you start off, you're like me, a person that's visited Marie's grave. I've been out to Sheridan County. I've been there. I not to brag, I actually got a tour of her younger sister in Flora, was still alive in 95, and it was on the Sandoz Ranch. And her younger sister came out there in a truck and gave me a tour. I'm going to write about that someday. But we have that book. It's really kind of an attack job on General Custer, and so need to be careful. We have ones like, now I'm really somebody's going to shut this video off. We have Terrible Glory by James Donovan. I find Mr. Donovan to be a wonderful storyteller. I find his writing to be a pleasure to read. But I'm going to say, for a book written as late as this one is, I think it came out in 2008. He basically just recycles a lot of the stuff that was pre-archaeology and a lot of stuff from the 20s and 10s. It's conspiracy filled. He pushes the Reno drinking. He pushes that there was a conspiracy. He pushes all kinds of stuff in here. It's a great apologetics book, but it's not factual. And others that have studied, I've read it. I got to tell you, I read this and I kind of went on a Nightingale Little Bighorn too. I got all spun up, and I was like, I calmed down. I was like, no, this is sloppy. I'll just, and if somebody like contact me, I'd be glad to go through it point by point. But it's a great read. It's engaging. It's fun. No doubt about it. Philbrick. Okay, so some of the people some of the experts whose names I've mentioned in part 2 consider Philbrick's battle description here to be very good. But the rest of his book, he gets a number of things wrong. And when I watched Nathaniel Philbrick claim that he has brought to bear some unique finding of George Armstrong Custer's body and the way it was mutilated, which I'll not go into on my video, but you can find Nathaniel Philbrick talking about this. It's interesting. I think it's a little off base, but this book is not a serious book. And the reason I bring it up because he gets on bunny trails, it seems like everywhere but the battle. I can go into specific. He had some unique findings about the mutilations of the general's body, which he did not. And then he uses that in interview after interview to spur the sale of his book. The other thing is, I think, whether I'm being unfair or unfair, I would say if you're looking for books to read, be very careful of authors who have Author of Mayflower and In the Heart of the Sea. And I understand he's writing something now about where the founding fathers of our country meandered. I mean, he's kind of he reminds me of a high school kid having to write chapter by chapter book reports, but they really don't know any depth on their subject. Philbrick came through this one, wrote his book. I don't know, it says Viking Press, I guess he partnered with, and they needed to get this thing out. And I'm sure they cashed some checks. Other books, Colonel Graham's The Story of the Little Bighorn. Not very specific. It is a great example of writing from, I think, the 1930s. Be aware, it's not bad, but yeah, actually it came out in 1926 by Century Company. Be aware, if you read this, it's probably going to be a pretty mild version of the writings at that time, except actually in Graham's defense, I think he's also a little critical of Custer here. Actually, and I think my criticism of this is that he's probably too critical and doesn't hit the facts. He doesn't hit the middle, right? Troopers with Custer by Brennenstuhl. I'm fortunate. I read this probably at a book about 70 of 80 or 90 I've read. And I think what struck me about chapter after chapter is that if I wish Mr. Brennenstuhl was alive, because I'd like to ask him, sir, did you cut the testimony off so it reflects unfavorably on General Custer? It's just chapter after chapter of like why it ends up creating an impression in my mind of why George Custer was a bad guy. And you don't have to do that. You just need to share the testimonies in their completeness. And by being complete, it's just like what I've gone through in part 2. I think it just reveals itself. Of course, I like to always have fun. Once again, marquees, save the last bullet for yourself. And actually, I was reading this morning, there's a 2018 academic, I think, peer-reviewed journal article out of a professor at University of Montana, and she has gone back and validated, looked at all the findings, the reviews of skeletal remains, the data from the Doug Scott and Richard Fox work, and she then even herself concedes at the end, I can't find any evidence of what Marquis is asserting here. It doesn't exist. Men were shot in the abdomen, men were clubbed, there's hardly any. There's not near the propensity of head wounds that we would normally expect on suicide victim or shots through here. Sorry, please forgive me for doing those signs, but his book is, you can read it, but I don't consider it very good. So with that, I think the challenge is, and I would exhort authors out there, serious ones that maybe, I think there's an opportunity to get a text out there that covers this thing and comprehensively, the entire 1875-76, what's going on. With that, best intro book, Custer Battlefield. We have solid advanced texts, those by Fred Wagner, Richard Fox, Michno, I'm going to get the Michael Donahue's Where the River Runs Red. Michael Donahue's also written others. There's one called Battle Lines, and it's a drawing battle lines, and it's all about the maps. Of course, I use maps. I do not own that book of Michael's, but I hear it is unbelievable. Mr. Donahue's works should be paid attention to. Of course, James Willard's Little Bighorn Diary and Into the Darkness. Those are solid historical kind of works as well. But other than that, I would say get out there like I did and enjoy yourself and work your way through it. Okay, views across the North Central Plains. So this battle fits in a bigger context. And again, as I mentioned, it was first called out by John Carroll with his federal view. So let's take a look at the federal view. Also, I'm going to be relying on other books such as this one by D.C. Poole, written in I think it was published in the 1880s, I believe, but it's still in print, and others. The reason this battle happened, and in fact, there's no disagreement on this, it was to get the Black Hills after the effort to purchase them had failed. In fact, Chief Red Cloud had been brought to, I have to be careful here, I think I'm all right, had been brought to Washington, D.C. in early 75, or he had been approached, and other chiefs may have gone there, and they turned down President Grant and his representatives. And so what we get into is that in the fall of 75, we start, when things become apparent, newspapers are clamoring out there. I may have said 15,000, I think it's 13,000 miners are in the Black Hills. The town of Deadwood is there. Settlement is moving at a rapid pace across the Missouri River. Railroads are coming west, are going to go, while the Union Pacific Railroad, of course, out of Council Bluffs, Iowa, to join up in Provo, Utah, from the leg out west. And it was being engineered by General Dodge, who lived in Council Bluffs, and others. Anyway, it's obvious that what this was about. It was about getting that land. And in fact, there was open talk in Congress and in departments of Interior and elsewhere that we need to whip these tribes into submission. But the federal view is one of departments and leaders being conflicted. But in the end, it was always about moving the Indians to reservations. It's interesting, the Treaty of 1868, what is the first thing that happens? Captain Cook comes out of, he's in Georgia, and he gets an assignment. We need you to go to the Whetstone Agency north of Fort Randall along the Missouri River, because Red Cloud and his people are coming there. I find that fascinating that Red Cloud and his people fight 65, 66, 67, and 68 so they can secure the Powder River country. A treaty is offered from the federal government. It's irrational that if I have been fighting for this land, I'm going to go live over by Sioux City or Yankton. I mean, that's silly. That's silly. And become a farmer, or I'm going to work for somebody for a wage. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But that's what this thing was all about. Steve Adelson, in his famous C-SPAN video, came out 12 years ago. He starts out by saying this was about land and minerals. That's what this was all, and railroads going west. That's what this was about. Again, before the battle, we see correspondence and reports written detailing circumstances of Indian disturbances and activities. They started to call them back out of the east. The certain wild and hostile bands of Sioux Indians in Dakota and Montana was written by Z. Chandler, Secretary of the Department of Interior, in April of 76. Chandler then sends something to a note to E.C. Watkins, Inspector General, November 75, prior to that, describing how from their central position, they strike to the east, north, and west, steal horses and plunder from all the surrounding tribes, as well as frontier settlers, while also asking that troops be sent the sooner the better, to whip them into submission. But you know, this federal view, it consists of conflicted policies of do-gooders and those who were pragmatic and just wanted to support the westward expansion. But many of the do-gooders also wanted to teach tribes how to farm, work, and more. But they too came back to the positions in the end, these do-gooders, of taking the land or creating Indian boarding schools, re-education camps, etc. In spite of all that General Grant or President Grant twisted over, in the end, he has did what every other leader in America beforehand has done for hundreds of years: take the land and turn the Indians into Christian farmers. That was what the federal view was of this, and it had been this way for a long time. One last thing, though, I do want to point out, and I have it sitting here. Where did they put it? Oh, yeah, is that Greg Michnow's work. Here it is, The Frontiersman Who Couldn't Shoot Straight. I got to tell you, I mentioned this earlier. This is a hard-hitting book, and Greg, if you better read the foreword, because Greg gives you a user's guide for this, and he says he's gonna bust some myths here. But actually, you know, the federal view in some ways, and this is probably more on the Army view, the federal view also was one of early on of actually was of protecting some of the tribes and that. And I think I'll get into that with the Army view. Now, let's move on to the Sod House Frontier View. Wonderful book. So this is probably a work that just really opened me up. This, if I have to say, if there was one work that got me out of just seeing the battle and trying to figure out, did Custer, did he know or did he not know? Was Benteen to come to his position or not? Could they get the packs there fast enough? Did Reno fail by withdrawing from the valley? What really, and without really being as considerate of, gee, we had 8 to 12,000 people here that had just been surprise attacked by an army from the north and east. This book by Everett Dick is amazing. In fact, for those of us that are watching the fictional Paramount Plus series, 1883, a number of us have noted after 4 episodes that on this adventure, now it's 1883, it's after most of this time has passed, and many of the tribes, they're all on reservations or they fled to the north in Canada. But regardless, they do not have thus far the travelers, as they're coming out of Texas, being assailed by Indians. And that actually is what indeed happened. And Everett Dick, from 1854 to 1890, this book came out in the 1930s. It is profound. It is chapter after chapter where Mr. Dick, and you can read this, he still gets Everett Dick, PhD, professor of history, Union College in Lincoln, Nebraska. He wrote this history dedicated to his mother and father, settled in Kansas during the closing years of the Sod House epic. But you know, he talks everybody through the town building phases, the river cities of the 1850s, the log cabin days, the pioneer finance, road ranches, sod houses, colonies and colonizing agencies, struggles with nature, homesteader days, homesteader cattleman wars, coming of the iron horse, the influence of churches, the Grange, and you know, teaching and so on. What was very interesting of this book is that it's 500 pages. I got to the end, I was waiting for the part where the town gets burned by the Indians or people get massacred by the Indians. He alludes to some of those. He has some of those in here, but in terms of the whole 500 pages, we're talking like maybe 5 pages. It just wasn't that big. It wasn't as profound as what we're led to believe through perceptions, okay, errant perceptions. So the Sod House view is one that, again, start out with the federal view. What was their incentives and motives? Now we got the Sod House. You know, we have European tribes coming west. These European tribes were opposite in terms of values, rules, lifestyles, more. We see in the 1860s, there were countless Texas Longhorn cattle tribes coming north. And if you don't think those cattlemen were armed, they were armed and they were likely able to take care of a lot. The Union Pacific is being built in the 1860s by General Dodge. I have read General Dodge's book about building that railroad. Yeah, he had his own force, and it never seems to, according to General Dodge, never got beyond nuisance level. There were certainly, they had to take precautions, but certainly the Sioux and Cheyenne, the Cheyenne particularly did not like that railroad, and neither did Red Cloud. We have miners. Of course, I have here 15,000 were there in the Black Hills. Wild Bill Hickok with 4,000 people were there. They were overrunning this whole area. The state of Nebraska was formed, I have here in 67. Actually, I think it was 69. But what's interesting is in 69, if you look at maps of the state of Nebraska, the counties are all drawn out. Now, I find that fascinating because Red Cloud had his agency in Northwest Nebraska, and I don't think he was going to have counties. Newspapers were clamoring for expansion and development of the Black Hills. Town associations were formed. As every one of these towns out here on the frontier, they had full-fledged militias, law enforcement. There were floods of people coming by riverboat, horse, stage, on foot. Homesteaders and ranchers were fighting each other across the region. I'm going to argue the Army was not even needed. I'm going to argue that we didn't need Crook. We didn't need Terry. We didn't need Gibbon. We didn't need them, because I'm going to say once you really study the numbers of the millions of Europeans coming across the Missouri River, however they could get and settle west with all of their capabilities, and the Texas cattlemen, and then the small, very small numbers of Sioux and Cheyenne that were left by then, this was not going to go very far if you were a member of the Sioux or Cheyenne, and they knew that. Yeah, the Sioux population was 25,000 compared to 33 million Americans. To me, this is a huge view. You've got the federal view, you have the sod house frontier view, and it's profound. Now, let's take a look at the Army view. Again, I'm going to grab Greg Mitchnow's tremendous book. But again, I don't think Mr. Mitchell will mind me giving a little warning. Make sure you read the foreword on this, because he tells you what he's going to do here. But basically, the Army actually is caught in the middle of this. And this goes on to the 1840s. They're caught in the middle, and actually, they are credited with being a force to try to enforce the treaties on behalf of the Indians. Greg will show in this book, and he has great documentation and references, that many of the forts early in America's history were built to protect the Indians from those coming west. The Army in the 1870s, they are very, very conflicted by this. I think even a starting student, we begin to read of what General Custer wrote in My Life in the Plains. We read what Gibbon wrote. We read what others wrote. And of course, when it was all over, we have these thoughts, as with Napoleon and the Iliad. I wonder what has been lost, as Napoleon wondered when they took out the Greeks, because they lost all of these higher ideals, things that were beautiful about these tribes. Frederick Benteen, classic. He says, it is in Charles Mills's biography of him, his attitudes were typical of an Army officer compelled to deal with them on a regular basis. Benteen said, "I cannot say I have had much heart on warring with Indians, for I've always been impressed with the belief that they were more sinned against than sinning." Captain Poole, in this book again, he says, "Those that had been some time associated with Indians assumed to know little of their character and usually had no plans for their management, and at one time may have had plans and policies, but actual contact had shaken their faith in making Indians first-class citizens and Christians. But a newly appointed attaché of the Indian Bureau, born and raised in the New England states, will unhesitantly mark out a course to pursue it to transform a savage into an enlightened citizen. Thus, distance lends enchantment to the view." I found that there are Indians and then there are Indians. but many people living at a distance judge them as one class. When reading accounts of cruel cruelty, they jump to the conclusion that all Indians, wherever found, are murderers and should be exterminated. The judgment would not be given upon a more intimate acquaintance with them. So, I mean, he's saying they're being broad brushed, that if you got to know these people, you wouldn't feel this way. And while Captain Poole was, there at the Whetstone Agency, was trying to fulfill his mission, um, he said they showed no genuine interest in farming. He said, while talking to Spotted Tail on the subject of farming, he seemed to take about as much real interest in the matter as a well-to-do farmer would were he be asked to adopt to the ways of the Sioux Indian. Captain Poole, for a man of those times, white man of his background and ancestry, in the end, Poole praised their simple form of government, their picturesque dress and habitations, their patriarchal surroundings, their hospitality, the bravery and endurance of their men, and the virtue and faithfulness of the women, living in quiet and peaceful contentment when removed from disturbing influences. But Poole also was critical of the disturbing element as old as the discovery of the continent, the white man, a representative of a superior race, armed with greater knowledge, creating discontent and bringing confusion into their councils, carrying civilization and its accompaniments, encroaching ruthlessly on the domain of the Indians in spite of treaties and promised protections. On the other hand, some generals such as Crook, John Carroll notes this in the Federal View. You can read General Crook's report in the fall of 1876 after the Little Bighorn, and he says the Treaty of 1868 has been regarded by the Indians as an instrument binding on us, but not on them. And also, they violated every leading feature in the treaty. Crook is very unapologetic for the actions of the Army and the U.S. government. He reports that there was no other choice. Colonel Gibbon, however, in October 1876 says, we were attempting to carry on operations with inadequate means. Had we been operating against only the Indians known to be hostile, any of the three columns sent against them would have been amply sufficient to cope with any force brought against it. But when the hostile body was reinforced by malcontents, driven to desperation by starvation and the heartless frauds perpetuated against them, the problem became less simple. The first information we had of the force and strategy opposed to us was the check given to Custer's column. Now, I read this, and we also today know through all of the writings and diaries and reports that Colonel Gibbon's force had been molested from March of 1876 until it joined with General Terry. We also do know that General Terry and them had reports of upwards of 5,000 warriors. So I find what Colonel Gibbon has written here to be a little convenient. But regardless, if you read what Gibbon says, he does talk about how things were being stirred up, frauds against them, things of this, and it just made it very difficult for the Army to do their job. So they were operating on the Army. I think, again, you'll see the Army was operating with a task they really didn't want. Some of them all had tremendous empathy for the tribes that they were being told to pursue and move. And, for the most part, it was a very, very difficult assignment. And obviously many of the Army members of the Army in some of these fights lost their lives. And as the Sioux and Cheyenne or other tribes, pick on what area of the country you're in, fought to defend their lives, their way of life. Which brings us to the Sioux and Cheyenne and other tribes' view. In this view, I'm kind of referring to many sources such as Crazy Horse by Kingsley Bray, The Lance and Shield by Utley, Black Elk Speaks by Neihart, Two Leggings autobiography, He's a Crow, Red Cloud by Robert Larson Jr., Wooden Leg by Marquis. I mean, you really, it's imperative, again, to see the totality, to understand all the parts, to understand that what happened on June 25th, why it happened, the orders that were given to create this 3-column force, Crook, Gibbon, and Terry. You need to understand the context in which all of this has happened, and it actually goes back decades, and it follows decades after. We see in these tribes that they had an exact opposite view of life, maturation, spirituality, community. Boys were expected, they were a hunter-gathering, a hunter-warrior society, matriarchal, I guess. The woman is at the center of it. The men going out, the women run the camp. Now we can, we flip this and say the men were out playing around and the women had to do all the work, and that's probably a good case to be made for that. But this was their society. It was communal. It was family. They did not believe in property per se. They lived in lodges that were 15 feet wide that had multi-generation families in them. They also went wide in those 15 feet wide teepees. They also raised everybody in a community. I'll admit I'm sitting in you can see my home here. Yeah, we know our neighbors, but I have no expectation that if I get in trouble, that the fellow 2 doors up is going to help my wife. I mean, our culture is totally different, and it's been that way. It sounds like since the first Europeans arrived. I'm broad brushing. I'm sure some people take offense to that. Visions, they were spiritual. These people were very in tune with their surroundings, creation, use of sweats, so on. They believed in the supernatural. We all believe. I'm a Catholic. We all believe in the supernatural. I carry my rosary every day. I mean, I would say even the atheist is supernatural in something. But I'm not here to get into that topic today, even though I did open up that can of worms. The bottom line is, Wooden Leg had noted sightings of deer changing into women. He writes about it, deer being reincarnated. It was common to believe that bullets passed through their bodies. There's actually good evidence. I am astounded that this happened. Of course, there's evidence it did not happen too. You became a man by age 14 by counting coup. Sometimes counting coup include killing an enemy tribe member. The respect for elders. They were very much in tune with elders. They rejected constructed homes. Captain Poole describes how they would build a log home or some home, and the members of these tribes would prefer to be in their teepees. To them, I'm not an expert on this. I do have some books about teepees and written by those in tune with tribal views. I bet that teepee is almost, I'm just guessing, is probably a spiritual instrument. And when the tribes were forced west, the Sioux, for instance, were in Ohio. But as they were all forced west, they began to live on these huge herds of buffalo. There were 60 million of those in 1840. And by 1890, there were just 500. Yes, they did war amongst themselves. Sitting Bull was warring with the Crow in the April of 1876. I can read Two Leggings, who's a Crow warrior right here. His account, this account here that he gave, he works and works and works to reach a higher level of esteem in his tribe, but it's all about attacking Blackfeet, attacking Shoshones, attacking, Ogallala, other tribes. So, I mean, this was a big part of their life. They saw a life of roaming freedom. They were not going to be farmers or tradesmen or wage slaves. They did also love the old days with the traders before the times of the Bozeman and Oregon trails. They had a cordial relationship with traders that was a symbiotic, but when westward settlement really started kicking off with what I'm calling the sod house frontier times, and other things, things did not go well. They began to fight back. Greatly diminished because of smallpox, cholera, other infectious diseases. They did view European Americans as a threat. They viewed them as being disease-ridden. They viewed them as a proponents of a life of slavery and control. Some of them feared these reservations as being prison camps. In fact, the writings of Josephine Wagner, when she did interviews, I haven't bought the book yet by Nebraska Press, but one thing that's intrigued me, I was able to read parts of it on Google Books, and you can read the accounts of them being horrified. I mean, not just horrified, just like, oh, no, I would rather go die in the mountains than go on that prison camp. That's how they viewed these. I mean, they're like, no, I can't go there. I can't go there. This is terrible. I can't go there. And as you branch out in your studies, as I have, say by reading about what happened in other parts of the U.S. I was going to grab a book. I've chosen not to grab it, but you'll find that, yeah, reservation life was not always a bucket of tea. They're also within the tribes. They had this view of loafers and versus loafers on the reservations as compared to the non-treaty Indians who were considered more traditionalist. As we heard from Poole, they oftentimes were played by federal officials and Indian agents to create dissension, or could be commercial operations of various kinds. Yeah, and so on. So, one last thing is, the Northern Cheyenne and Wooden Legs book, which I would encourage. Again, this is a great book for if you want to go kind of deep in here. So this has been around forever. It's like a classic. It's like required reading. It's like, it's not even, I wouldn't call this stakes for the table. You just got to read it if you want to understand this subject. He describes in there how their societies were very complex. They had warrior societies such as the elk, the crazy dog, and fox, and each society having a distinct role within the tribe, complementary to other roles, all the way to those filled by as many as 20 members who lived in each 15 to 17 foot wide teepee constructed with about 17 buffalo hides. The Northern Cheyenne and Sioux were complex societies built around mature, defined roles and responsibilities and obligations, whether at peace or battle. Each warrior society had a leading war chief and then 9 more little chiefs. Overall, there were 74 chiefs within this count, and there were many distinct roles and levels and assignments. So you can read again in Wooden Leg all about this. My point is that these societies were not, they were not simple at all. So let's see, we went through federal, we went through Army, we went through sod house, frontier, and the tribes. Those 4 views, perspectives, this is what the battle sits within. So this battle, I'm not sure it should even be called a battle. It was an action called on to get these folks on the reservations so settlement could go on to get the minerals and the land and expansions. That's what this was. With that, we have also one last thing before I move on. I put this map here. I just added this again. I wanted to, if you go back when I send a deck, you'll see where the tribes were at this time. Keep in mind, they had been moving west as things came west. And of course, we have the Blackfoot and Gross Ventures. We have the Assinbone. We have the Sioux. We have the Arikara, Mandan. We have the Crow. We have this area here. You'll see the word unceded territory. Now, this gets to be kind of a cloudy area. Was it Crow land or was it Sioux land? From a functional standpoint, it would appear that the Secretary of the Interior, President Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, they just saw it all as functionally where the Sioux were at and unceded territory. If you look at the official documents of the Treaty of 1868, you'll see, I believe the line is where I have to be careful. There's a line that rolls along, and possibly where Sitting Bull's camp was Crow land. But I would say, again, this is where context comes important. 1865, 66, 67, 68, Red Cloud's War, what we call Red Cloud's War, was fought over control over the Powder River country by Red Cloud's people. And keep in mind, these tribes, They didn't sign these treaties. Some of them did, some didn't. Some may have touched the pen for a little while, like Red Cloud, and he did it a while later. And then he says, no, this thing, no, I'm not agreeing to that. You're breaking all the rules, and no, we never agreed to that. So I think you just have to keep that in mind here. One other, yeah. So always be, I think, aware of that. Hope this is helpful to you. All right, the Chiefs, as we run down to the last couple few slides. You know, the Chiefs, they were not, of course, as you listen to me with the tribes, they were not unified at all. You had traditionalists, and then you had some that, let's take Plenty-Coup. Plenty-Coup later took the position, he had a vision, and he describes it here. It was his vision. You know, every warrior tries to aspire to have a vision when they're, I think when they're 14 or 18, when they're along that period of life. And his vision was of a chickadee, and he's a crow, and he became the leader of the crow. And he said the chickadee is the quiet bird. While all the others are fighting and dying, he said the chickadee is quiet. And he says, I'm being told by the Great Spirit to be like a chickadee. If we will align ourselves with those folks from the East and we're quiet, we will be saved. And that was their strategy. So they would be that way. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. If you read, you know, Crazy Horse, probably what is considered to be the most authoritative book, which, by the way, Kingsley Bray relies heavily on Marie Sandos's interview notes for her Strange Man of the Ogallala Crazy Horse book, which gets some criticism today, but I think, despite what I said about Marie's Little Bighorn book, that book's well worth the read. Her Cheyenne Autumn book, which certainly gets criticized today too, about the flight of the Cheyenne back from Oklahoma back to their home, basically what they consider homeland, in Dakotas and Montana. I think it's a worthy read too, but you know, there's more modern works that are more specific and correct some things that Marie may have glossed over. But bottom line is that, you know, here we have the story of a traditionalist. Sitting Bull at the end, before he was killed, died, he said, am I the last Indian left? Because all the others have sold out to become loafers, to be on the dole, to get the government handouts, to be taken care of on the reservations. So we had those. We had chiefs, which I'm going to get to in a minute, such as Red Cloud, who I think when I speak the Red Cloud, I have a slide on him. We're trying to always find the way. They were kind of like Plenty-Coup, but they didn't just lay down. He was like, I know who I'm dealing with, going back to 1865. And in the end, Red Cloud lost. I mean, when I get to Red Cloud and I'll speak to him, you know, he lost basically everything he had. You know, he tremendous sacrifice. So he may not have looked at the traditional. He didn't look at the traditionalists, the pure hardcore ones, such as Red Cloud, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull that way. So bottom line, the Arikara, we're trying to kind of warm up to the Army. If we go back again to this map, every one of these tribes were going different way. One of the things I find interesting about the Crow is that I believe in 1887, there was a Crow uprising, and where they tried to take out the U.S. Army, and they had an uprising, and then it was a number of them were killed. So a lot of these alliances were based on views of these tribes were based at the time. In 76, you know, we have the Arikara and we have the Crow. We have some are allied with the Army, kind of to get the upper hand, and also to just survive, like that quiet chickadee that Plenty-Coup had that vision of. On the other hand, inside the larger Sioux, we have different maneuvering. I think it's just imperative that you read about these chiefs and read everything, so you don't fall into a trap of seeing them as one monolith. They're not. George Armstrong Custer. Gee, I love him, and I do love him. Where's Audie at? Audie. Okay, so George R. Custer, yes. General Custer. we have the officers in the 7th. Of course, of course, I've already referred to much in my battle talk and in my preliminary talks. Um, you know, um, you need to, undoubtedly read, I don't know if I have it sitting here. I don't see it laying here, but Robert Utley, Jay Monahan, those are some of the early, probably the 2 cornerstone biographies that reasonably accepted. Of course, I've made some comments earlier about Frederick Whitaker's Life of Custer that came out in October 76. I don't need to cover that again. But to know this man, and the Little Bighorn Associates is about the studying of the times, actually in the life of George Armstrong Custer as he interacted with events throughout his life. But you need to understand his Civil War career. You need to understand his upbringing, obviously, how he became appointed to West Point, his West Point career, everything that made him. I mean, if we could have given him a personality test with any number of the tools that some of us use today to just understand how people think, I think we can say he's an achiever. He's a bit of an introvert. Isn't that interesting? But yet he could be an extrovert. His wife, Libby, writes about him having a bit of a stutter. There's moments in her writings of her 3 books where she says the general, when they were in Fort Lincoln in Bismarck, or south of Bismarck, he would go off to be by himself because he probably was exhausted just being constantly having to greet people. But he's a very, very complex guy. I don't think anybody calls George Armstrong Custer stupid. I think he's a very bright man, but he's also he's also of his time. He's an individual that T.J. Stiles describes in his book, Custer Trials, which I won an award from the Little Bighorn Associates. T.J. Stiles won a Pulitzer Prize. He describes George Custer as a man who's caught between the old days, pre-Civil War, and the post days of the industrial age coming to bear. And he comes, not that money makes you or makes any difference, but it's fair to say that he's trying to figure out, how do I operate in this new world as it's changing, and so you'll read about that. He's incredibly, I'd say complex person. He writes a lot. He's My Life on the Plains. Actually, as T.J. Stiles notes, it actually was not as well received as maybe we consider it, or it became after his death. At times it was somewhat panned, got some bad reviews and things like that. But he's definitely, some people consider him the hero of Gettysburg. For his actions, sacrificial to the extreme, that were part of the effort to stop Jeb Stuart's cavalry as they came around per General Lee to try to get around the backside of the Union forces and support the advance from the front of the Confederates were making. But to defeat on the 3rd day, to defeat the Union forces there. But I mean, he's incredibly colorful. You should read, the writings of those that were with him in the 3rd Michigan Division. You should read the writings of those about his life and the Civil War. But Custer's offers, and also the 7th. Let's move over to, of course, Major Reno. There's a tremendous biography of him. I've actually ordered it. I've not read it yet. Major Reno in 1864 is called by Phil Sheridan the brightest, most promising young cavalry officer all in the Army that the Union had. Frederick Benteen, gee whiz, he came from Missouri, was enlisted, became an officer. He felt, I need to serve my country in the Civil War because we're being misserved. We don't have good enough caliber men to serve and lead men in battle. And I'm going to get involved after he learned of some defeats of the Union forces in Missouri and elsewhere. And he did get involved. And he personally, with his forces, pressed General Price, who was in Missouri, out of Missouri over into Kansas. He goes on and has a career in the Civil War that I'm not a Civil War extreme expert, but it sure sounds like it rivals Custer's. He's involved in the chasing down of Jefferson Davis, fighting after April 1865. He's in Georgia. There was a terrible fight, war in I think Columbia or Columbus, Georgia, or Columbia, Georgia, that Bentine's involved in. He's involved in things down along the Mississippi River, victory after victory after victory. Several recommendations become a brevet brigadier general are attributed to him. Major Reno, actually, when he leaves when the end of the Civil War, he actually is the same as General Custer. So I mean, the officers of the 7th, they're Civil War veterans, yeah, there's most of them are, and every single one of them has gone through a lot and is very, very talented, capable, trained. Many of them were West Pointers and so on. But as I discussed, the 7th Cavalry was only at about 40% strength, and they'd never been together before this campaign in all 12 companies. Congress had cut the pay of soldiers again and again. And in 1876, the post-Civil War Army was under siege. Robert Utley's book, Frontier Regulars, the U.S. Army and the Indian, Robert Utley, this is, I call it required reading. He really goes through what the circumstances of the Army with its understaffing. When I mentioned in the battle that the 7th Cavalry only had 40 men per company, they actually, again, were authorized to 70, but they didn't have the money, nor were they able to recruit. And if they'd even had the man, they might not have even been able to feed them, but wouldn't have had a big enough pack train to support them in battle. And they also, they just wouldn't have functioned if they'd been any better, bigger, any better based on the funding they received. In April 76, Congress cut the pay of soldiers. They were under siege in Congress because you have to keep in mind, there was an effort in Congress to get the military to make them so they had no power in the South. That was what this was all about. We were trying to kill Reconstruction, so what was going on. 30% of the Army at this time were just abject alcoholics. There were tremendous desertions. But again, there was a core of very rough men. We also had, horses. They became a burden after a few days. They moved slower than walking. Army horses ate oats. Sioux and Cheyenne ate grass. So the Sioux and Cheyenne horses were always in better condition. Of course, we've talked about the pack mules. We talked about the horse holder issues. An interesting thing that's come up in the writings is that could the 7th Cavalry deal with wounded? What was Custer? Was he even able to tend to his wounded of those 5 companies up there? Probably not. There's been some suggestions that there was a hospital of sort they tried to create, but most of the experts that I've referenced in earlier parts of this have shot that down. I've talked about their guns. Those guns were very difficult. The 6-shot and the Springfield carbine, to reload them while you're moving on horses. You can't try. Imagine you're bouncing. You're trying to reload this spring. You can't do that. You're gonna get knocked off by a warrior and hit and clubbed. You're gonna be killed. I've discussed that the 7th Cavalry did have this clique of Custerites and non-Custerites. There was a lot of nepotism in Custer's headquarters. Like I mentioned, his brother-in-law is Calhoun, but he's also got his brother. He's got his other brothers. He's got, it's just there's just a lot of Custerites versus non-Custerites. As Michael Donahue says in Where the Rivers Run Red, right here, I have Michael's book. It's just, if you can get a copy, it's, I think Michael has a new printing coming out. He says that, he quotes that Custer was a complex individual with a paradoxical personality described in extreme and contradictory terminology. He was a prankster, a serious, he could be a womanizer, a dedicated husband. He was naive, a visionary, empathetic, cruel, cowardly, and heroic. Then an officer that knew Custer, quoted by Michael Donahue, he was the personification of bravery and dash. If he had only added discretion to his valor, he would have been a perfect soldier. His impetuousness often ran away with his judgment. He was impatient of control. He liked to act independently of others and take all the risks and the glory to himself. He frequently got himself into trouble by assuming more authority than really belonged to his rank. He was a natural optimist. He took rose-colored views of everything. He had a historical memory, but not a historical mind. He was no philosopher. He was not a student or deep thinker, Officer William Ludlow. Some have suggested that in 68, 67, that the finding of Lieutenant Kidder's body there in Kansas, massacred and skinned, really impacted him and caused him to make that fateful trip to Fort Wallace, where he was ultimately court-martialed when he went to go see Libby. But Custer also here in 76 was very eager to make it big. He had funded by seeking New York investors a mining operation in Colorado that was not going well. It was not well. It was hardly managed. I think by 76, my view from reading all of these materials is that he's trying to find himself. But I would say this, and this is where I plug Michael Donahue's book. Michael Donahue has done a wonderful job of covering how Custer approached battles, everything from the Battle of Washita to Yellowstone to on through Little Bighorn and so on. And he has a lot of great commentary and also a lot of just insights on evidence that, of course, the general was using hostages to be able to bring things to an end without much loss of blood. Lastly, I'm going to wrap up my talk by talking about Red Cloud. As I said earlier, on May 16th, 1876, Red Cloud is in the game. I don't need to go back through the actions between him and Crook on that day. But as I've reflected on everything about all the people, I know we give credit to Sitting Bull and we give credit to Crazy Horse, but I just have in my mind thinking all the way back to the 1860s, thinking back to that fateful day, thinking of Red Cloud's many trips to DC, to the negotiating, the things he was trying to accomplish. He looked unfavorably at Spotted Tail. He saw Spotted Tail as being too pleasing. He saw, on the other hand, Crazy Horse and City Bull and their type being too the other side. I think this man was trying to find a way, but he was not hesitant at all to bark and to kill if need be. In fact, I understand his scalp shirt is in Cody at the Buffalo Bill Museum there in Cody, Wyoming. Has 100 scalps on it. I think this guy was for real. He was very serious, but he also saw that everything the government was doing was about stalling so they could just flood the area. He tried to use the Eastern Press. He used the relationships. He and Spotted Tail in 1880, they went to the Carlisle School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and they brought back 65 children after they saw how they were being treated there. He was a dedicated Catholic and he resisted others. He insisted that James Cook keep his portrait hanging at the Cook Ranch in western Nebraska. It still hangs there today. It's on the Agate Fossil National Park out there in western Nebraska. There's a wonderful collection of red clouds and American horse and others. It's worth getting to. It's south of Fort Robb, I think about 40 miles. It's in kind of the middle of nowhere, but it's a beautiful place to see. It has a tremendous facility, museum. As I mentioned earlier, he was not impressed with Washington, the U.S. Navy guns and things he saw. He was very strategic. And I think that, what he did, and, in May of 1865, he led a large expedition against a military fortification against the Platte. They were very good. They also were able to organize it, up to 1,000 lodges of Ogallala, Malaconjus, Sans Arcs, Brulés, and Cheyenne of northern and southern tribes. They had Cheyenne dog soldiers, keeping this force together. He actually was able to organize warriors and entire camps in a way that rivaled that of a regiment, as we see. So I consider Chief Red Cloud to be an incredibly important person. With that, that's my talk. I hope those 4 views, I hope pausing on the individuals at the end helps you. I hope the battle talk was helpful. I also hope my discussion on myths, my talks also about the other perspectives at part 1. I hope all of this is helpful to you. And if anyone has any questions or any challenges or criticisms, feel free to post them. I will just say my heart here is only to lay this out based on all of my experiences of studying this and give you the tools to go find this for yourself. But as I've gone along, I have been honest and said, this is where I'm at today, keeping in mind where Gary Gallagher's at, which is one letter can change your whole view. With that, I think I would just say, things to study. I've gone through a variety of books. I would also seek out, I'll be reposting all of the books that I have written summaries on. One of those is a wonderful, it's actually a wonderful book on the history of the battlefield. It's by Don Rickey Jr. That's been incredibly insightful to me of the area since 1877 on through about 1970. That's when that book covers. I think the history of the battlefield itself, the property, how it moved into federal hands, how it became under the care of the National Park Service, and all of the things that have happened. I would say these views, the materials I've done there, the people. I'd also say get out and experience the battlefield in the North Central Plains. The fellow who who, because of his sister-in-law, actually it's his brother, Jeff Barnes's brother, lives in the area where I live, and his wife goes to my church. Her name's Andrea. But Jeff wrote a wonderful book on Custer, 85 forts, fights, and other sites. I think getting out and seeing where Custer was at is incredibly valuable. I've been to Fort Wallace probably 3 times. I've been to Fort Hayes multiple times. I've been to Fort Lincoln multiple times. I'm out about trying to Standing Rock, getting up on the, to see where Red Cloud's buried, go see where the Battle of Blue Water's at. Now that's back in the 1860s in Nebraska, getting down, going all over, just get out and see these spots. And in Wyoming and Montana and Nebraska, I mean, you've got to experience them, I think. So if you can, but if you can't, that's fine too. There's tremendous resources. We have Google Maps, we have wonderful photography and videos. I'd also say be sure to visit the National Park Service YouTube channel. There's a tremendous amount of materials there. And with that, I think that's the end of how to study and learn about the Battle of Bighorn. I hope this is helpful to you. And again, send me questions and answers to my posts, and we'll go from there. Thanks.